What if the Muslims won the Battle of Tours, or the Battle of Poitiers as it is sometimes called? One of history's most lightning-like military accomplishments is the Arab invasions of the 700s. Within a generation of the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, the armies of Islam had conquered most of the Near East, threatening the Byzantine capital of Constantinople itself. In 711, after conquering Egypt and North Africa, Muslim armies crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and attacked the Christian kingdom of Spain, which had been established by the descendants of the Visigoths who beat Rome at Adrianople. The Muslims crushed the Visigoths' army and killed their king Roderick. In less than a decade, the Muslims conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula. They called their kingdom Al-Andalus. Then in 720, they crossed the Pyrenees Mountains to attack the region known as Septimania, today part of France. At the time, it had been a Visigothic province in Gaul. Furthermore, it was the doorway into which Arab authors refer to as the Great Land, a vague term not just for Gaul but for all of Europe. Some even envisioned their armies marching all their way to Constantinople, attacking the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire by the back door, as it were. The Muslims quickly took the city of Narbonne, an old Roman colony, and an excellent strategic base. They were defeated outside Toulouse in 721, when their commander was killed. The presence of a seasoned and disciplined officer prevented the setback from turning into a rout. He led an orderly retreat to Narbonne. By the mid-730s, all the major cities of the French Mediterranean coast between the Pyrenees and the Rhone were in Muslim hands. Strong central government was the exception, not the rule in the early Middle Ages. Across the Pyrenees, the kingdom of the Franks was more like a collection of quarreling princes. In Al-Andalus, a fault line ran between the Arab elite and the Berber tribesmen of North Africa, recent converts to Islam. So, Abd al-Rahman, the man who prevented the Muslims from falling apart after the death of their commander, drove all the way north to Poitiers, just short of the great sanctuary of Saint Martin de Tours. Tours is only a little over 200 miles from Paris. However, the Muslims would go no further, somewhere between the cities of Poitiers and Tours. Perhaps at Moussac on the old Roman road, they met the army of the leader of the Franks, Charles the Pipinid. In theory, only kind of like a prime minister. He was the de facto king of the Frankish kingdoms. So, we don't really know too much about the Battle of Tours. Contemporary evidence insists that the battle took place on a Saturday in the month of October, although we're not sure if it took place in 732 or 733. There was skirmishing for 7 days, each side observing the other, looking for some advantage of timing. And this suggests that the two forces were relatively evenly matched. That is, each side had roughly 15,000 men, to make an educated guess. Although they were cavalry, the heart of the Frankish army was the infantry, who fought closely massed and wore heavy armor, carried large wooden shields, and fought with swords, spears, and axes. The Muslims were renowned for the cavalry. Their infantry adopted the European style of heavy armor, perhaps with mixed emotions. So, the battle continued until nightfall. The next day, the Franks approached the Muslims' tents in battle order, expecting a fight. However, the enemy had withdrawn after the leader was killed, Abd al-Rahman. Now, the killing of Abd al-Rahman is perhaps the most decisive fact of the battle. He was the sole man that was keeping all of the diverse Muslims together, and after he was killed, well, the Muslims had no other choice yet to retreat. Edward Gibbon, who had written The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, imagined if the Arabs had won by the Battle of Tours, perhaps the interpretation of the Quran would now be taught at the schools of Oxford, and their pulpits might demonstrate to a circumcised people the sanctity and truth of the revelation of Muhammad. However, other scholars argue that the Battle of Poitiers didn't really make much of a difference, and that even if Abd al-Rahman had won the day, they couldn't have made much of an excursion. Now, there was also the question of revolts that were about to burst forth in Spain in the 730s and 40s. Revolts both on the parts of Berbers and Arabs. So, what if instead of the general of the Muslims being killed, the general of the Franks, Charles Martel, lay dead with many of his men? A Muslim victory might have rendered Poitiers an expedition that showed that it was still possible to carve into Europe. So even if the Muslim expedition of 732 was far from an all-out attack, it is hard to imagine it simply stopping going home after having faced a challenge from the war leader of the Franks and having killed him. After all, the attack on Spain in 711 also brings us as a raid victory, which whetted the appetite for conquest. Meanwhile, the sons of Charles, no longer surnamed Martel, would have quarreled over the succession. No doubt one of them would have prevailed eventually, and the new leader would have to deal with the Muslims. That is, if he had the energy to deal with what his father did. As for the Muslims, had they maintained their hold on the province across the Pyrenees, sooner or later they would have given in to the temptation to expand it. After all, even with the expulsion from Septimania in 759, even with Charlemagne's and his generals' campaigns across the Pyrenees in 778 and 801, the Muslims continued to raid southern France until 915. With cities like Narbonne and Avignon as bases, they would have no need to be content with mere raids. The Muslims might have returned to the practice of sending governors of Spain to command their armies, as they had before Charles' victory at Tours. So what would a Muslim Western Europe, an Al-Andalus stretching from Gibraltar to Scandinavia, from Ireland to the Vistula, or even beyond, have been like? Christianity would have survived. However, it would have been a protected and ever-shrinking enclave, not the ruling faith. While continuing to practice a religion, many Christians would have been all but Arabs in their language and customs, just as happened in the Muslim Spain. Many would have gone all the way and converted to Islam, as many Christians did in Spain, and more would have if not for the steady advance of the Christian Reconquista. No doubt the vast majority of Europeans would have become Muslims, as the vast majority of North Africans and Middle Easterns eventually did. Nor would have Christianity spread across the globe. If Western Europeans had crossed the Atlantic in 1492, they would have done so under the banner not of the cross but of the crescent. A great naval power in the Mediterranean under the Umayyad dynasty, a great trading power in the Indian Ocean after the advent of the Portuguese, Islam is likely to have taken to the Atlantic with gusto. Today there would be only one world religion, Islam. In Europe, meanwhile, the Muslim elite would have been glad to make the most of their new provinces, conquered after Abd al-Rahman's victory at Poiters. The Muslims built in Spain, arguably the most civilized Western European society since the Roman Empire's heyday. So, if the Muslims were to expand into Western Europe, think of a Muslim Spain expanding all across Europe. Europe would have gained much had Al-Andalus spread north to the Pyrenees. In Spain, North Africa, and the Near East, indeed wherever they went, the Muslims encouraged prosperity through trade, agricultural, irrigation works, and city building. However, in the short term, even if Islam creates growth, fosters technology, in the long term, however, the empire will be technologically stagnant. So historians have no easy time explaining why Christian Europe rose to world power while the scientific-minded Islamic world didn't. However, it's precisely because there was no centralizing authority in Western Europe. There was feudal government, there was contradiction, there was violence, there was competition. This all drove innovation and invention, things that would not have been present in a uniform Muslim empire. So, the culture that developed in Europe was, compared to Islam, decentralized, secularized, individualistic, profit-driven. It had little respect for the older civilizations to the south. So the irony is that this might not have happened if, for the Dark Ages, this growth in technology was perhaps a product of the Dark Ages, and the Dark Ages were perhaps necessary to foster this growth. A European caliphate after 732 might have guaranteed stability and cultural resplendation, but it would have nipped modernity in the bud. Neither caliphate would have permitted the freedom and restlessness out of which the European takeoff eventually emerged. So that's all I have to say. Europe, under the Muslims, will be much less advanced than it is in our timeline. It would probably be on a technological level of the 1200s, and even before that, the early Middle Ages is more likely. Although the Muslims fostered scientific knowledge and growth, they did not foster new technology, new innovation. They took much of what was already known and disseminated it, spread it, and preserved it throughout Europe's dark ages. Thanks for watching. This is Scholar of the World, and make sure to subscribe for more great content.